Susan Schreiman. I'm director of An-Ford-Vasa, the institute that is hosting our hour in Ireland. And I also would like to thank a couple of people before we start who've been working with Jeffrey's team to make this happen. And one is Charlene McGilligan, who's here, who's been doing all the tech checks for the last while, and Emma Clark, my colleague who's been working with me on various projects, has also been helping to publicize this. So I'm really delighted that we're able to participate, and I've been able to assemble a panel of colleagues from both in academia and out, and this was very important to me when I put it together, that we had a real variety of perspectives from different disciplinary areas. So maybe what I'll do is introduce the people. Our plan is to have lightning presentations, 5 of them, and then have some time for discussion both within the group here and online as well. So I'll introduce everybody in advance so I don't break the flow. So the first speaker is Michael Baum, and he's Associate Director of Risk Management International here in Ireland. Afra Carr is, in fact, my co-chair. She's also here at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and she's in the Department of Sociology. The second speaker will be Mark Maguire, who's the head of the Department of Anthropology, also here at Maynooth. Saeed McCarthy, who is the director of the Centre for Irish and European Security, again here in Dublin. Maria Helen Murphy, who is a lecturer in the Department of Law, here again at Maynooth. And then myself, who will also co-chair the discussion. So we'll have about 25-30 minutes of talks, and that'll leave us plenty of time for conversation. So the first speaker will be Michael Baum, and in fact there are some PowerPoint slides for this, so we'll go to that.
Okay, hi, it's Michael here. It's good to be online and nice to be amongst you all as a worldwide community. I come from the world of business and in particular the world of risk, and with that the perspective I have and will share with you today is in relation to how far we are seeing issues of both privacy and surveillance being of a concern to us. Moving on just to the next slide there, which is my second slide. Just bear with me a sec. Can I get my own system to go on here? There we go. And following the global financial crisis, we are seeing substantial cost-cutting being taking place by business. And IT is seen very much as a solution to the cost problem. The difficulty I have with that is that while customers are liking it, and so are the accountants, equally the criminals and the attackers are exploiting the weaknesses in existing systems, and business is reluctant to invest to resolve the issues which are sometimes seen as techie. Also, we find that technology is poorly represented in the boardroom, and many companies are struggling to understand the new world order in the digital and knowledge-based economies. Likewise, governments, whilst they're concerned, are yet dependent upon business for many core services, and we're finding that governments themselves are continuing to outsource services to private third-party providers and therefore to privatise many of their activities. Generally, legislation is slow to emerge, and concerns focus on privacy issues rather than upon the consequences of businesses' failures which arise from attacks. So in Europe, we're finding that the EU is developing responses, but again, the process is slow. We only saw the establishment of a European initiative last year with Europol, the setup of EC3, and there is currently new European legislation ongoing in relation to information security. So business essentially survives and thrives on growth, and let me share where we're seeing growth and how this will affect the future. With outsourcing of solutions, businesses are ceding ownership of core technology, which in itself perpetuates the lack of understanding of what can go wrong, as third parties are often seen as bulletproof. Increasingly, as data builds and the knowledge economy builds on the back of that, we're seeing that the internationalization of the internet, particularly the evolution of English language countries in the form of China, India, Africa, where there's good knowledge skills, are attracting attackers to the Western economies, where there's much more wealth and much greater intellectual capital. And so the whole question of surveillance and privacy very, very much come to the fore. So we're finding attackers are increasingly able and adept at undermining poor business security and affecting attacks resulting in loss of data and increased financial crime. This model can also move to those supporting causes, terrorists, and ultimately to cyber warfare, which is seen as the new paradigm. Important to note that the US declared cyber as the 5th jurisdiction as far ago as June 2011. Business is thus in the middle between consumers and government, providing services and solutions, but slow to champion the cause of anything that could interfere with growth and profit. So what then is vulnerable? I spend quite a bit of my time working at the level of critical national infrastructure. This would include utility services, transport, payment systems, food distribution, and other critical activities. The World Wide Web equally is obviously involved in supporting growth, and we're seeing substantial evolution of new business models, and on the back of that, generally an acceptance that the evolution of the business model continues to change with technology. But coming with that globalization of business, this is also stretching the operational paradigm around the globe, and with 24/7 capability now required, means that risks require to be managed in real time, both around the globe and round the clock, representing a new challenge to the business model. Oh, sorry, I've gone past that. Finally then, just in terms of drawing some conclusions, because it is a lightning strike here, consumers we find are disinclined to see privacy as an issue until it is violated. Consumers and businesses, together with governments in many jurisdictions, do not see and cannot understand the potential dangers emerging from the digitally enabled generation. They want the advantages, but are unwilling to accept restrictions. Business, I believe, has a duty to act responsibly, but it is driven by profit, and there's a lack of appreciation of how privacy violation is undermining the business model. Law enforcement are aware of the issues, but are faced with the question of what is an acceptable level of crime, and so far the answer is that the consumer is prepared to pay the price, and business to avoid the costs in order to pursue growth and profit. Government is keen to gain growth while still seeking to effect better regulation. Few, I believe, foresee disaster. Fewer still appreciate the implications longer term as technology dependence grows and the knowledge economy matures. In short, I see exciting times ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Mark, I believe you're next.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Just on a probably slightly different note, I realise to begin with that surveillance is on everybody's lips right now, especially in the light of Edward Snowden's revelations, and also, of course, controversies that are continuing to rumble on here in Ireland about surveillance. And one of the striking aspects about all of this is the techno science involved, which is one of the things I want to draw to the fore a little bit. Now, once upon a time when we used the term like surveillance, it implied something like Lysander spotter planes over South Armagh, or a chain smoker in an unmarked car mysteriously parked outside your house. But of course, what we're living through now is a digital industrial revolution, and now we imply metadata, biometrics, return to databases at very, very high speeds. In this context, it's really interesting to start zoning in on the language we use and the specific examples that we choose to research. A number of years ago, the UK columnist Brendan O'Neill wrote a very interesting article based in the UK in which he said that the UK government could no longer be accused of being Big Brother. It was, in fact, and I quote, the Willy Wonka of social control, churning out increasingly bizarre and fantastical forms of government. Now, what he chose as examples were really quite striking. First of all, this is well known, the UK actually approximately has about 20% of the world's surveillance cameras. But on top of that, he pointed to examples like, and I quote, weaponized classical music, that municipal authorities were blasting out Beethoven's pastoral symphony to deter loitering youth. And of course, there's mosquito alarms which emit high-frequency sounds audible only to teenagers. Now, the interesting dimension to all of this, of course, is that when we use a term like surveillance, it doesn't capture the full range of different transformations that are taking place, or the uses of technology for social ends. Instead, I prefer to think in terms of security as a more primary kind of concept, And I prefer to think of it as an active concept, which produces its own insecurities. In other words, insecuritization. And I think that's actually one of the most interesting trends to actually track in the present moment. But what do we mean by this particularly? I'm a little bit hesitant since I'm in the company of a legal scholar, but if I go back as far back as 1794 to Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, he's a wonderful expression in which he said, there are moments in which we have to draw a veil over liberty as we hide the statues of the gods. And the really interesting point he makes is that it's in a moment. It's exceptional. Really, for generations of political thinkers, security was something that manifested itself in crisis or emergency. They understood, and I think very profoundly so, that there's a difference between what facilitates life to be lived securely and that which makes life worth living. In other words, you don't bring security out and make it actually the form of governance. And it seems to me that that's one of the things we've actually done today. So what happens when security is out is my question. I just want to draw very briefly a couple of examples. I've been involved in research on international migration for a number of years. I studied biometric security in the US and also in the Gulf state of Qatar in the Middle East. And I switched a number of years ago to actually look at counter-terrorism. And I went through the training program as a counter-terrorist officer, actually, in quite interesting ways. So just to dwell on this for a second. So in airports these days, international airports, skilled officers are trained to go around and search for abnormal behaviour in queues for maleficence in different levels. And an airport like Heathrow, for example, has 65 million passengers pass through it every year. So it's an extraordinary endeavour. And what I was interested in as an anthropologist was the skilled ways in which they inculcate the senses of actually how to pick up an abnormal behaviour. We even saw a terrorist, actually. But terrorists are actually very rare animals. Generally what happened was low-end, low criminality was picked up. But as those officers were doing their job, over elsewhere in the world of techno-science, the US government, for example, has produced a system called FAST, Future Attribute Screening Technology, which actually screens for biometrics, facial expressions, skin's electrical resistance, eye movement, motion, video recording, voice modulation. There's even a fidget detector. And what we find, of course, is that one and the same time there's an emphasis on security through personnel, and there's an emphasis on finding ways to exceed the human through technology. But that's one slightly disturbing example. Another example I've been looking at recently is predictive policing. In other words, efforts to predict where and when crime will happen and policing in the future, essentially. Now this springs from the work of an anthropologist, Jeffrey Brantingham, who was interested in optimal forager theory, which is not based on rational choice, but the idea that foragers have distinct paths and they move through the world in particular ways. But he teamed up with computer scientists to produce PredPol, which is an international system for policing future crimes, in which officers are directed towards 500 by 500 square foot boxes, and they patrol in those areas because that's where the crime may happen in the future. But with all of these systems, what we actually find is a very interesting rendering of human behaviour, which is of great interest to me. What we also find is a lack of evidence, a lack of cause and effect, basically. Many officers who I spoke to use predictive policing, either locally or international systems like PredPol, actually point out the very obvious fact that if you're patrolling in a particular area, you're actually probably engaged in community policing, and you're mistaking that for predictive analytics very often. So those officers, even on the ground, are actually attending to the fact that we're using techno-science, sometimes without evidence, and sometimes, which is actually the interesting dimension, because of a phantasmagoria of fears of potential threats in the future. And I just speak to this point as is raised already. One of the key issues, even for business, I would suspect, is that as there's so much discourse on surveillance and security, we actually lose precision. We actually forget what the real threats actually are. And that's very important to point out. Seeing as I mentioned my own discipline, I'll just conclude by saying something on that. Many, many years ago, one of the ancestors of my discipline, Gregory Bateson, who was an extraordinary individual, anthropologist, he was one of the fathers of cybernetic theory. He was also a secret agent, which I think is fascinating. But he wrote a brilliant piece of work in which he talked about the future of the computer as a governance tool. And he said, when the computer heaves and cranks and gives an answer, we're all a little bit less responsible for that answer. But he also said, what we need to do is not understand just the rules of the game, but learn the language through which we might actually change it. And I think we might begin that process by seeing security as a hugely important issue in which surveillance and privacy is one aspect of it. I think we need to look at the contemporary moment in terms of the use of technoscience, often without any evidential basis, but sometimes even fetishized as a solution for problems we may not actually have. Thank you.
Hi, yes, I'm Sarah McCarthy from the CIS. Susan, thanks for inviting me here today. I think I'm going to be talking a little bit about social media as a tool of the state, and I think this quite naturally follows on from what Mark's just been speaking about. One of the first things I think we think about is that the state relationships with technology are incredibly complex. The state instrumentalizes technology for its own purposes in different manners. And particularly technologies that are organic and sort of aren't created or developed by the state originally. So there's something that has emerged like social media, which is a form of communication that can't really be controlled and probably isn't very well understood by agencies of the state, and yet they feel the need to take this technology and in some way use it for the benefit of society, or as they perceive it to be. Social media is interesting because it is particularly used as a sort of, it's valorized as a technology which can help us find terrorists. It can identify violent radicalization on the internet in that sort of surveillance thing. This is a very useful tool, and it's also often spoken of in terms of economic development. But then it's also demonized as a tool that can promote violent radicalization or can promote these things. And some good examples of this are where you see people talking about the use of Twitter or Facebook as a means of facilitating or enabling democratic uprisings, the Arab Spring, in an attempt to overthrow dictatorial and unfit government. We can say that, Twitter has allowed this to be made more feasible, let's say. But then the opposite of that is when we had the London riots in 2011, there was an absolute sense that, from a government perspective, that Twitter or BlackBerry messaging systems were enabling, or even in some cases they were described as being causal in relation to the London riots. And of course that's seen as a bad thing, and yet it's exactly the same technology in many respects being used by the same people in the same way. So how else does the state then actually deal with this? What's the best way for them to manage this technology? And I couldn't agree more with Mark in just relation to how much we valorize, or we have this technological fetishism. If it exists, we must do something with it. There can be no sense that we ever just let it sit there and see what happens. Give it 5 years and see what happens then. Oh gosh, no, we have to do something immediately. So in general terms, the state looks at social media in the following ways. One, it's a means of amplification of the message, right? So you want to tell something, you want to communicate something to the citizens. You could say it's a tool of propaganda in many respects. It's quite uncontrolled. There's no mediation. If the police want to tweet something, there's no journalist sitting in the middle validating what that tweet has said, whether it's accurate or inaccurate or whatever. So there's the application of the message. It's definitely used for surveillance. There's a lot of evidence at the moment that the use of social media for surveillance by law enforcement agencies is increasing. It's tied closely to predictive policing as well. And then the other side of that is social media is a bilateral technology. Now this is something that's quite novel in terms of state surveillance particularly, because traditionally we think about things like CCTV. The CCTV is observing people. It's the panopticon, it's the sort of looking out and observing everything. You never know when you're being watched. With social media, you're pushing something out, but you can also ask back. So you can ask people for information. So in times of crisis, you can ask, is there flooding in your area? Can you tell us something? And the other thing you can do is you can ask people to send back information about other people. And that then becomes quite a different sort of technology and a different sort of surveillance. So this bilateral communication method means that there does need to be some elements of trust established. And if you only use the technology as amplification or as surveillance, you cannot then expect to have the trust relationship that's needed when you require the citizens to give you back information through the social media, because you have no mechanism for validating who that person is, the credibility or the stakeholder relationship that individual is coming back to you. So for those reasons, when the state uses social media without engaging in a proper strategy, in building a trust network, in understanding that it's not something that can be just used and instrumentalized, especially in relation to surveillance, you're not necessarily going to get good outcomes when you need something back. So I think I've probably used up my time, so I'll leave it there.
Maria.
Thank you. Well, I was delighted to be asked here today, which are times which are very exciting for privacy lawyers like myself. While the topic under discussion here today is privacy and surveillance in the digital age, I wanted to take a step back and take something of a more historical perspective to consider what lessons can be learned or maybe should have been learned from previous events. It's often pointed out that privacy is a difficult right to pin down, yet at the same time, it's widely recognised as an essential constituent value in any democratic society. And while there are different iterations of privacy across the globe, we do find some recognition of a right to be let alone transcends almost all cultures throughout history. So while we have this right to privacy recognised as being of fundamental importance, we do of course also recognise that there are inherent limitations on this right, that sometimes limitations on the right to privacy will be necessary to protect the democratic state itself. So throughout time, those in power have needed to observe individuals or suspect groups in order to protect the interests of the state. Accordingly, surveillance is not a new phenomenon, it's an ancient one. That being said, it goes without saying that the massive proliferation of information in the modern digital world, where we constantly leave traces, the digitization of that information and increased searchability of that information, and the constantly expanding capabilities of surveillance technologies all mean that a greater threat than ever is being posed by government surveillance. I do think it is important, though, to continue to recognise the perennial themes that emerge again and again, and to see whether we can set a different course for future. And one consistently underlying factor when we debate these issues, when we consider the balance between surveillance and privacy, is the politics of public opinion. So in times of threat, for example, public fear can be taken hold of and used to further limit our rights to privacy in general society. While the expression, "you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear," may be ridiculed by those of us who are privacy conscious, it still carries considerable rhetorical sway amongst the general populace. This complacency is occasionally checked, and very often this role is performed by the media and by the press. An example of this in recent years was the News of the World scandal. So we had the exposure of phone hacking, of celebrities, of politicians, of members of the royal family, and there was mild public interest. As soon as the relatable, recognisable figure of Millie Dowler and her family became part of the story, the increase in public outrage was palpable. When this happens, when revelations like this occur, people stop and think, the intangible becomes material, and people realise there might be something worth protecting here, and they think about how they can do that. So obviously, the massive issue that we're also aware of now is what has been the debate that's emerged following the Snowden revelations. And one interesting factor about Snowden revelations is how there is a general feeling, a general perception of personal harm, that everybody feels that they have been affected by this, that it's not just the other which has been affected, because that is the traditional view. Depending on your point or time in history, this other who privacy benefits may have been subversive, may have been communist, or may have been religious fundamentalists. That doesn't seem to be so much a part of the dialogue in the current debate. For example, we've seen in some polls in recent times that there has been quite a remarkable shift in public opinion regarding the appropriate balance to be drawn between civil liberties and protection of the security of the state. For example, we've seen protests against the NSA surveillance, we've seen far greater interest, particularly amongst members of the media, but also amongst the general population, in privacy-enhancing technology such as email encryption. So privacy issues have also seen resurged interest in the European Union. Not only have we seen member state leaders such as Angela Merkel come out against the NSA, we've seen renewed interest in data protection reform and enhancement, but most notably we've seen very strong opinions coming out of the Court of Justice of the European Union. We've seen the Data Retention Directive be found to be disproportionate interference with the right to respect for private life, and even more recently we've seen a very firm recognition by the Court of Justice of the fundamental importance of the right to protection of personal data and the right to privacy in the famous Google right to be forgotten case last week. So while it's not argued that the Snowden revelations have directly influenced these developments, it cannot be denied that the Snowden revelations have created a more favourable environment for privacy protective measures. Whether or not this will lead to long-lasting changes in public perception or long-lasting privacy-enhancing regulations remains to be seen. We have seen the pendulum swing back sharply in the past, but hopefully with knowledge, what we've learned from previous privacy scandals, we may actually be able to ensure a steadier path into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our contributors so far. I'd like to point out that we also have a few people in the audience, and as we do our discussion, we'll also, if you'd like to contribute, just try and catch my attention, introduce yourself, and you can look at the time. Great. So we've had a wide-ranging set of contributions here, Michael looking at and business, some of the issues emerging there, Mark broadening it out to look at security more generally, but techno-science and the technologies involved, size and your contributions looking at the state, but more particularly social media and trust networks, and then Maria coming back and bringing us back around to privacy and some of the legal changes that we've seen historically and today. And maybe just to get the ball rolling, if I may, I'd like to just come back. Maria, you've given us something of a sense of privacy and how it might be seen in the legal sphere. But in terms of the topic today, how would other people see, or would somebody else like to contribute or kick us off, looking at your sense of, or how you use privacy, how you understand the concept? Would anybody like to kick us off?
I'm happy to start off this. When we're looking at the work we do is really around the societal impact of security solutions, processes, technologies even, and which is quite broad. In relation to privacy, I think we usually try and think about the privacy in the sense of the right to a private life. And there's often a kind of a sort of a sense these days that if people, are prepared to put information about themselves on Facebook or on Twitter or something else, then that they give up any right to the privacy of that information. And I suppose we would kind of say, well, that's not entirely true. I don't accept that just because it's out there, right? Just because it's freely available doesn't necessarily mean you should just do anything with it. And there's complex issues around the, in terms of data protection and privacy around information about individuals, because one piece of information maybe can be accessed by anybody because you've posted it publicly on Facebook, but when you concatenate different pieces of information together, you're actually creating something else. And that something else hasn't been freely given, has not been, given up. So this idea that just because you've said something that allows Facebook to merge different pieces of information about you, and then they can go and try and sell you something on that basis, I don't necessarily agree with that. And furthermore, just to make the point, and Maria mentioned data protection reform, if Facebook accidentally sell you the wrong thing because their algorithm, when they concatenate data, doesn't necessarily get the right results, that's annoying, but not life-threatening. If the same technology is used by law enforcement agents and they get it wrong, and they, and this infers that you have some violent radical tendencies, then that is serious. So.
I might just pick up on that because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, but the European Court of Justice decision, I think seemed to me, as a layman's kind of read, was less to do with information being out there, but more of a recognition of the power of databases, the power of companies like Google, for holding kind of a digital self together in a way that was kind of recognizably new. And I think that's absolutely correct, actually, to think about this then in terms of both historical examples, but I'd also add in kind of some cross-cultural ones to this. I mean, for example, I've mentioned very briefly, we are kind of also living through a secure identity revolution in many ways in terms of technology. And it always strikes me, and I'm kind of half quoting Naomi Klein here, but the real laboratories through which these things are hammered out are not this part of the world. They're the experimental zones, the Chinese export zones, places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where biometrics really took off in totalitarian instances very often. And so what's interesting to me about this, and just really drawing what Cy was saying, is that let's just take the US created database, which is stored in the US, but has a generate footprint in Iraq of biometric fingerprints, iris scans, etc. They took the entire population of Fallujah and securitized it. What happens when that data gets transferred to provisional government? What happens if it moves from one sector of society to another? What we have here is information specific to the human body. And I think you're right, absolutely. When you look back even to the older discussions of the emergence of fingerprinting, our societies had these debates already. And there was a general sense, absolutely, fine for prostitutes, immigrants, migrant poor, but anything that's redolent of empire cannot be in the home country. And there was a bulwark around this, particularly around universal identification. So there's a whole range of really interesting issues that we need to broaden out and be a bit more global and historical on.
I mean, recently in surveillance studies, they had an article where people were looking at the concept of privacy, and they were saying that from a social science, from a non-legalistic perspective now, it actually was becoming a very difficult concept to work with. It's very individualized, it's very kind of closed down, it's about rights, and that actually we need to open it out into something a bit broader, less individualized in the current context. I wonder what you kind of think of that. The problem with privacy, of course, is that privacy, as we talk about it here, it's contextual, right? It's privacy. Privacy. There's no such thing really as privacy. There's what you want to keep private and from whom you want to keep private. And what we kind of see. Might jump back in here.
But that's just. That is sort of what the issue is really, because it's people say, oh well, kids these days put everything up on Facebook. Well, they may do, but they're not going to let, my son isn't going to let me see it. He's perfectly well aware of who he wants to be able to see it and who he doesn't. So they don't, this idea that the kind of younger, the digital age, that they sort of have given up privacy, I don't accept that at all. The bigger issue around the whole kind of, what's private, it really all comes back to something, and I'm sure Mark or Maria might go speak this. When this kind of surveillance, right, is not about managing risk, it's about controlling the population. That's what it's about. So when the sort of mechanism of the state management, managing the state, managing our society, is done through control, then you can't have privacy. It just can't exist within that societal structure. And I think that's really where I see us going at the moment. It's sort of creeping along. We definitely have it at borders. We don't manage risk. We control movement flows. And we are increasingly getting it into urban areas as well.
Maria, did you want to come back in on that? There is no such thing as privacy.
Oh no, I completely. It's both a sociological, a political, and a legal concept, and all are interconnected and relevant. Anyone will admit, all the big legal scholars will admit that privacy is simply an umbrella term. It's not a precise descriptor. Just on the point of individualization, I think that's certainly true. And even the European Court of Human Rights will openly acknowledge the fact that we shouldn't view it as an individual right, that in addition to being an individually recognised right in the treaties, it is also a societal good, a constitutive factor in democratic society. It's also, I think, it annoys me when I hear people talking about, like Sun Microsystems Sky, privacy is dead. That's quite a dated statement now, but it gets brought out again and again, and studies of younger people show they're actually particularly protective of their privacy. And from a legal perspective, just to go back to it, if we look at the Charter of Fundamental Rights, we have two rights there. We both have the right to respect for private life, and we have the right to protect for data protection, or the protection of personal data. And that can actually be very helpful in these types of more modern, in terms of having control over your data, as opposed to preventing the initial infringement.
And the second one seems to get a lot of the attention, the data.
From the European Union particularly perspective, because obviously from the European Court of Human Rights perspective, we don't have that explicit data protection right, apart from if we look to the convention itself coming from the Council of Europe. It's kind of been moulded into the Article 8 right to respect for private life.
Michael, do you want to come in and tell us something about how businesses, or how the businesses that you're working with might be approaching privacy, or how privacy is used within that context?
I think traditionally privacy was seen as the right to quiet enjoyment of your assets or of what you owned. I think in a business context, there's a great struggle happening between the right to privacy, which is that quiet enjoyment of yourself, and the increasing creation of a digital identity. Because today we all now have a series of digits which define us and which protect us, whether that's passwords or codes, log-on sequences or however. And the violation of that has become a great issue, because I believe business is in very many cases the weak link in the chain here. And what we're seeing is that as every business moves onto the internet, the quality of protection which they're applying to your information and or data is in many cases weak and variable. And attackers are finding these weaknesses, they're exploiting those, and suddenly then you, the citizen, are very challenged, because if your digital identity becomes a subject then of being fraudulently used or abused, this causes massive distress to people, and is not, I don't think it's fairly recognised for that element of distress. So I think again that the concept, we would debate the issue that if you do not pay for the product, is the business entitled to see you as the product? And if so, what protection are you entitled to have to the information that you may have ticked the box to say, yes, I'm happy to take a free email service, but does that mean they have the right forever to analyse me to death, and to market me to death, and to violate my privacy to degrees to which I probably was never given a warning notice or led to understand that this was the consequences of me ticking a box that said, yes, I'll take a free service. So I think business has a great deal more to do to act responsibly in protection of the citizen and not in the exploitation of the citizen than is currently the case.
I think maybe we have a sense. Sorry, Susan.
Just follow up. So I come from a state where loyalty cards are a lot bigger than they are here. So it's not just ticking a box, but if I actively use my loyalty card and I'm getting something in return, does that change the relationship between what the business can do with my data? Is it an exchange then, or the
Well, I suppose
same rights still?
I think the question becomes how far a business has the right to trade your data. A loyalty scheme, as I would understand it, that's they're tallying up your usage of their services to give you rewards, and that's privy to you and the business. Where on the other hand, you sign up for a service and tick the box to take the free service, and they then trade and market that information to the ends of the earth. I'm challenging how far your privacy has been violated to the extent that you expected that to happen. Sorry.
Maria, you want to come in now?
Yeah, great, because I think here we're actually seeing, interesting you mentioned the US, because I think we're seeing the fork in the road, a divergence between the US approach and the rest of the world, and the European approach. That the EU is really getting behind this idea of enhanced data protection. Whether or not it will actually be effective is another question. Regarding the tick box, that would, in the European context, really make you question, do we have effective consent here? Can this constitute consent? Now, you can have other legal grounds, so if you are simply using it to collect points and it's not being used for any other analysis purposes, that could potentially be fine, it could be legitimate business use. But then you have all these additional questions that come along with data protection law regarding you still have some right over data collected about you. So, as we saw in the Google right to be forgotten case, some right to be forgotten. Maybe you want to close your account and that means they should delete all your data. Maybe you should be able to request, and there should be systems in place for you to easily request to see what patterns they have established between your data and what presumptions they've made about your profile as a shopper because of what you've bought.
Do we have a false sense of security in Europe, that Europe will protect us from these companies that are going to exploit our data?
I don't think we have a false sense of security. I'm not even completely convinced that we're necessarily, kind of more conscious of security, particularly. Some people would argue that with the current sort of changes that have taken place in the States, that they actually have a better response now to the kind of the surveillance, the state surveillance, as carried out, as Snowden reveals them, in fact, in Europe. But just on that sort of idea of are we, first of all, the problem with Europe, of course, is it's not homogenous. So it's not, there is no European in this context, because Germany has a completely different understanding of the importance of privacy and data protection than, say, Ireland and the UK have. We have a much lower standard, just culturally. Somebody else here might understand why that is. There's lots of different theories, but that's, and so you often get this disparity between what's wanted by one member state and another, and we constantly get this tension between us. And I don't even think it's true that we're more conscious of security or privacy in Europe than in the US. I'm not entirely sure that's true. So I'm not actually feeling any huge change in the politics or even the public kind of demand for anything in Europe post-Snowden. I'm not hearing it. It's not a topic that's coming up in the current European elections, for instance, at all.
Which is interesting. I want to bring in one of the members of our audience. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Tracy Lorio on the Programmable City project. I was thinking about what you were saying, Mark, and what came to mind was manufacturing insecurity, and I'm thinking of persons of interest, CSI, Minority Report, 24, and as they're manufacturing insecurity, they're also manufacturing the right and the need for government and policing to integrate databases. And so then I start thinking of the Internet of Things, I start thinking of smart cities, I start thinking of big data, insurance, health, those kinds of data, administrative data coming from the state, surveillance types of devices, and then other kind of mobile types of devices that are primarily in the private sector that are being accessed and integrated and worked on. So I wonder if, to fetishize techno-science, so to speak, and solutions, I think that there's a discourse in there of propagating these types of technologies and pushing these kinds of infrastructures without addressing, I think, the integration and the cross-matching and the data and the security and insecurity issues related to that.
Yeah, just to pick up, because it's really where I wanted to actually go, is the kind of question you're posing there. There's one aspect we could look at very clearly, which is there are certain kind of institutions that are still perfectly functional even in our modern era. It's like the RAND Corporation, who tend to predict the future and publish many, many books and influence politics accordingly. So, for example, on the topic of policing, they very clearly tell us that we've left the era of community policing, of police on the streets, and we're entering an era they call intelligence-led policing, where really what's interesting is the distrust of human beings. So once the uniformed, shiny-booted officer, be it on any level of society, was actually an expert on some level, or trusted, they were professionals. And we seem to have entered an era in which they're kind of now prone to boredom, prone to bias, really being downsized. And there's a sense that technology is going to offer a new way of governing societies, basically. And I was really struck, actually, just at the beginning of this discussion, actually, with the notion of outsourcing here. Let's not forget the role of outsourcing with the Snowden affair. Let's not forget the role of outsourcing and then outsourcing again and again. And very often, even the language of this is about solutions, the techno solutions to social issues that we pretty much don't really necessarily understand. Look at our discussion of privacy. I mean, I can point to a couple of cultures in the world where there's pretty much no concept necessarily of privacy, but there is, as Maria really astutely points out. Go beyond the word and look at the practices. The right to kind of be left alone on some level, not for social space, but from interference. That tends to translate. And I think what actually seems to be happening here is words that we kind of understood, that went without saying, like trust, like privacy, have now been caught up in a new way of thinking about how to govern, basically. And it transcends business and the state. These are like Laurel and Hardy, they're going together all the time anyway. So there's a whole broad set of issues that I think we're picking up on now, and I think we still lack the language to actually debate this on a societal level, I have to say.
There's a sort of the techno-solutionism, and I think just to Tracy, this is exactly as Mark said, this is the issue. I mean, the creation of the security and the insecurity is, there's a sort of a security theatre, okay, where we've created this landscape of threat. There's no empirical evidence for their threat, there's no reality to the threat, but the threat is useful. And it's useful for solutionism, because we have technologies that we need to do something with, and if we want to do something with them, we better find a problem that needs to be solved. So, hence security theatre, hence techno-solutionism. And importantly, really importantly, not only do these techno-solutions not resolve any particular threat, but they create threat. They actually create insecurities. So there was no insecurity. The security theatre gives a perception of it, but by implementing certain types of technologies, you create power disparities, you fracture societal cohesion. I mean, even sort of some of the things we talk about, just, to tip back slightly to the data protection thing, I mean, it's very obvious that the relationship between the citizen and the state now, if you are a nice middle-class person with a job, you have very little to do with the state in terms of information about you. They know what you earn, you pay your taxes. If you are in receipt of welfare, the state knows an awful lot about you. They know all about your health, they know all about your employment, they know about your family, they know about where you live, they know about how much water you use. So already we've got this disparity between who do we know about, who do we not know about, and it's sort of back to your thing, like what was possible. And so these technologies are doing as much damage as they are doing good, in my opinion.
So as we retreat to techno-solutionism or the legalistic, what other solutions are there? So as academics, as people who teach students, as people who work in business or advise the state, how can we intervene in this? How can we maybe change the agenda?
Well, picking up on those points, I do think it's broadly recognised now that if we are to have a more privacy protective society moving forward, we need to design for privacy, that there needs to be technologically based solutions. Think about, as Tracy mentioned, the Internet of Things, incredible amount of data being collected, being connected, being extremely descriptive data. You need to build in some sort of siloing system there, some sort of protective system, some sort of pseudonymization, all these types of technical solutions. But on the other hand, you very rarely get any sort of technical impetus being taken by tech companies without some sort of legal mandate coming along with it. So I think two things very much go hand in hand, that putting IT guys in the same room as lawyers at the formative stages would be particularly beneficial, and taking into account all these social factors, because the law is inspired by social factors. I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned how the poor people in society are the ones who are most surveyed. That goes as far as the DNA that's held on people in the UK tends to be members of minority groups from disadvantaged environments. So all of these things should be taken into account of at the formative stages. So we have identified the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything as it's now being called, as being the hot new thing. But people need to get into a room together and come up with policy strategies.
And do we have the right people in place as we face into European elections that actually can understand the challenges here?
I think it would be better if, I could agree more with Maria there, because that's what I do. So I'm happy that you think it's a good idea. I think it's nearly like we have to step back and say, look, what is the demand, what is the need, right? So, we're trying to figure out maybe how to make technologies, design them, privacy by design or something like that. But actually what you really need to be saying is, well, what are we doing this for in the first place? What is the problem that we're trying to solve that requires an Internet of Things or a smart city or whatever it is, or a smart border? And I think that's we're not getting good leadership at a political level. So I would say that the economics of technology are driving the political narrative in this regard. So we have no interest in saying, hey, take a step back for a second and let's stop trying to solve everything stop trying to engineer every solution to society, because there isn't really, that's not how the Western economic model works. Maybe I've strayed too far into some things like, but that is what that is, I think, where we are.
And do we see that specifically in some of the work around the borders? I know your work around security.
Well, you can take an example of something like smart borders, which is the entry-exit system, which is currently kind of on the table at the European Parliament and is well sort of under the way design stage. And The premise of smart borders, the premise of an entry-exit system, is that in Europe, it's very hard to track overstayers. So you have a visa to come into Europe, but because you can move around any country, and we don't stamp visas on the way out, you've no way of knowing who never goes home, all right? So on the basis of that, we have the premise is that there are lots of people overstaying in Europe, and therefore we have to have a system where it's an entry-exit system, so you get stamped in and you get stamped out, and now we know how many people are overstaying. Well, first of all, there's no good statistics on how many are involved. And then the second thing is, great, now we know that there's 20,000 people overstayed. Well, okay, what are we going to do now? You can't find them. Oh, wait, then maybe we better get, anytime somebody looks like they might, they shouldn't be here, let's take their fingerprints. So you can see where this is going. It starts off, and nobody has even agreed on the empirical number of overstayers, or to what extent it's detrimental for Europe, but they do overstay. Probably they're contributing to the economy. They're certainly not taking from it, because they can't claim unemployment, they can't claim health services, but yet we're investing like over €1 billion. This isn't like a small amount of money. This is a massive amount of money. For what? So I think that's does that sort of answer the question about where is this coming from? Who is driving that agenda?
And you did research, Mark, in the States. Is it a similar along the borders?
Well, yeah, and absolutely I'd agree with Si on this. I mean, to take very quickly two brief examples of this, but just on the evidential policies of this is one of the key issues. For example, in the realm of terrorism, we know who the terrorists are. If you want to find terrorists, we can find them at street level. They're residual terrorists. They're the same groups that have been blowing stuff up for decades, basically. But the phantasmagoria of the unknown terrorist with a never-before-seen weapon intended to cause the greatest amount, etc., etc., is terribly politically useful. But it's not empirical, and there's a problem with that. And it just goes back to an earlier comment I made. One of the real issues at the moment is this phantasmagoria of threats is distracting for potentially where there's real threats, where the actually work can actually be done. On the other level, take the US. This is really interesting on this, because the US and Europe are actually also quite synergistic occasionally. But in the US, there's a very strong discourse emerging from Homeland Security particularly, that we can solve an old problem in America. People that are in America but not of America. In other words, people that cross borders but aren't citizens. You know those people? They feed you, basically. They work in your homes, they run your factories, etc. And the notion is appearing as kind of like graduated citizenship. We'll give them techno-scientific citizenship, fingerprint them, pass cards, they can get a driver's license, a little bit of healthcare, but they're not going to be real citizens. Now there's an issue. That's a societal decision I don't think anybody has discussed, actually, of a graduated form of citizenship. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same discourse appears in Europe, actually.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, the other sort of issue is exactly the same sort of discourse is occurring in Europe. And by the way, one of the ways they manage, one of the ways you go from not really knowing if we have an overstayer problem or the size of it, to investing billions of euros in it, is to conflate immigration and terrorism. And this is so this is back to the sort of this is the how you do it is you go, oh, well, if we don't know who all these people are, they could be terrorists. There's no evidence that they are. There's no suspicion, really, but it's a very useful political narrative to get money to spend on something that you want to spend money on.
Would you take one brief question from the floor before we move towards the end? Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Song Yue, also from the Programmable City Project.
Okay.
So I was very shortly say to comment. First one is that we also need to start unpick the landscape of technologies because not all the technologies just are trying to do the same thing as we've been criticized here. So for example, in the using IT support in emergency response, they are trying to incorporate very much of the ethical, legal, and social issues to try to support different kinds of privacy security practices that happen in everyday life, and try to incorporate how their practices into the understanding and the designing of IT technologies. And I think one of the great points from previous conversation is that privacy is not something that. Privacy is very much about managing boundaries, and that's one of the early research on designing technologies to support privacy is building on that kind of notion. And the other thing is that we not only need to look at the kind of one function being used for security purposes, but also different kinds of techniques that being developed for non-security related domains but used in security purposes. For example, image recognition techniques being used from industry to use in airport screening, and what kinds of differences and tensions would emerge from that kind of cross-discipline, cross-domain integration of techniques. That's also important.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Sonia. So I think there what we're seeing is that there are spaces for intervention for humanists and social sciences, which is a very good place to start wrapping this up. I think it's moving us towards the end. Susan, would you like to say some concluding comments?
No, I'm just going to thank everybody for their participation. It's been a really fabulous and very interesting conversation. And I hope, Jeffrey, I know you're there because you're tweeting, a good kickoff to this symposium. So thank you all very much for participating, and for the audience in the room for being with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.